Correct.
And when did you receive your PhD?
In May of 2012, I believe.
May of 2012. What was your dissertation on?
My dissertation was on an examination of medieval church cemeteries from Spain.
What about that examination?
So it was essentially what we would call like a bioarchaeological analysis. So I looked at health, disease, patterns of like trauma in the bones from these people. So essentially what it's trying to do is recreate the past lifeways of these individuals that lived during medieval times.
And when is medieval defined as?
I guess I don't know how it's literally defined as. The cemeteries that I examined were from around 900 AD to around 1700, 1800 AD.
Okay. And then what about, did you also have to do, that was your dissertation for your doctorate?
Correct.
And I'm sorry, when was that?
I graduated with my doctorate in 2012.
2012. And what about your master's? What did you have to do a paper to receive a master's?
For one of them, yes. And so for the Masters of Science, I had to write a thesis,
Okay.
and that was on the estimation of age at death using the human sacrum.
Okay. Now, when you were talking about that and showing the pictures of the article, comparing the cut marks to the tooth marks a moment ago, what was the name of that article?
It's got a long name. I don't remember the name off the top of my head.
Very much. Well, let me even back up a second. So you got your PhD in 2012. When did you get your master's? The one where you did that paper?
2007.
2007. Okay, and you just moved over, did you say to be an assistant professor?
At Western Carolina University?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm an assistant professor and also the coordinator of the forensic anthropology program there.
And what's the difference between a professor and assistant professor?
It's just like a ranking level. So essentially you start as an assistant, and then you work there at a school for between 5 and 6 years, and then you're promoted to associate, and then you work there for another 5 or 6 years, and you're promoted to full professor.
Okay. Have you done any work specifically in relation to marks left on bone by wild pigs?
No objection, Your Honor. Based on the ruling.
Well, I'll overrule the objection, but I'm sure both parties understand the court's ruling, and we'll see how that examination develops. Chris, you may answer the question.
And so, I'm sorry, just repeat the question real quick.
Have you done any work which involved looking at tooth marks on bone left by wild pigs?
No.
And have you ever seen the incisors of a wild pig while still attached to the jaw, and top incisors?
So just to specify, because there was a discussion earlier about.
I do object as to one of relevance, and again, the same objection with respect to the court's ruling.
So the objection is overruled.
So just to clarify, with regard to incisor teeth versus tusk teeth, I would just ask you to clarify which one you're talking about. Does that make sense? Because I don't know if the tusks count as the actual incisor teeth. It's a class of tooth issue.
You don't know whether the tusks are considered incisors?
Yeah, it's a class of tooth kind of thing. So when we think about the teeth in our mouth, we have incisor teeth and canine teeth and premolars and molars. And what I'm saying is the tusks are unique to pigs, and so I don't know if they're technically count as incisor teeth if they're their own dental structure. Does that kind of make sense?
And when you say you don't know, is it fair to say that it's possible they have a separate classification, you're just unaware of it? You don't know, right, one way or the other?
Yeah, I'm not sure if they count as incisor teeth or if they have incisor teeth and then they have tusks as their own type of class of tooth.
So you don't know. you believe to be, sorry, let's call them, would the incisors include the two front teeth? Is that normally considered incisors? When I say two front,
Objection, that's assuming the pigs have two front teeth, and and the fact that they may not, that's a misleading question.
I'll overrule the objection. You may answer the question.
So when I think of incisor teeth, right, I think about them like these front flat teeth that we have in our mouths. Those are what I would consider to be incisor teeth, if that's what you're referring to.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And we'll just leave, but when we talk about incisors, we'll leave tusks out of it.
Okay.
We'll consider those something, we'll consider those tusks.
Sure.
Okay, so do you know what the top incisors to a wild pig look like?
All I can say is they are going to be similar to other incisors. I can't say that specifically what they look like.
Okay. And would you agree, okay, let's talk that article I just referenced where you were shown the pictures.
The bloom and shine.
Yeah.
Okay.
You referred to those markings on the bone as carnivore
Correct.
markings, right?
Correct.
And that article is actually pretty specific about what type of carnivores left those marks.
Correct.
What kind of carnivores were those?
I believe they were hyenas and then maybe lions.
And what teeth do lions use when leaving marks like that?
Well, I can't say specifically which teeth, but when we're talking about these types of carnivore teeth, they're using their pointed canine teeth or their carnassial teeth particularly.
So those pictures represented indentation scrapes left by canine teeth, correct?
Or carnassial teeth.
Okay, but not incisors, correct?
Correct. Be unlikely.
Okay, now you have reviewed literature regarding the way pigs leave markings, correct?
Correct.
And you would agree that the markings left by pigs are not by canines, correct?
By the canine teeth, you mean?
Yes,
I believe so.
you believe.
I believe that's what the article was talking about, yeah.
Didn't the article say that pigs, the markings left on bones by pigs as a result of the incisors?
Well, it's the anterior kind of rooting teeth, which I believe they're talking about the incisors.
Okay. And you had also talked about scoring, correct?
Sure.
And is it fair to say that you left a little of the definition of scoring out?
Maybe. I'm not really sure where you're going with it.
Isn't characteristic specifically associated with scoring is the leaving of parallel lines?
Well, if you only have one tooth, it can't be a parallel line.
What about if it's the edges of one tooth? Wouldn't that leave a parallel line?
Well, if it's a canine tooth, for example, it's not going to have an edge. It's going to have one point.
Let's talk about, incisors are flat, correct? Generally
Yeah,
speaking.
Generally speaking, yeah.
And so that was to score a bone. That would leave parallel lines, correct?
It could leave parallel lines. I've never encountered that before, in my experience.
You provided the state with an article, right, called Disarticulation Pattern Tooth Mark Artifacts Associated with Pig Scavenging of Human Remains.
The article by Berryman, I believe so.
Yes. And isn't it true in that article, it says characteristics specifically associated with pig scavenging consists of elongated and often multiple parallel scoring?
Yes, often multiple parallel scoring. Yes, it does. I believe say that.
And you would agree that what the prosecutor labeled is marks 1, 2, 3, 4 on the jawbone. 1 and 2 were parallel with each other.
Yeah, they're relatively
And
parallel.
3 and 4 were parallel with each other.
Sure.
Okay. You also talked about striations.
Mhm.
And you would agree that in what the prosecutor has referred to as those lines 1, 2, 3, and 4, well, let me back up a second, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Would you agree that cut marks or bone are referred to as kerf marks?
Cut marks on bone are referred to as kerf marks?
Right.
Yes, they typically are.
And a kerf would be, and it can be a Y, a V, a U, but it consists of the floor and the walls, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And when a serrated blade makes a kerf mark, the striations are actually left on the walls of the kerf, correct?
They can be. They don't have to be. It kind of depends on the angle of the knife and how the knife enters the bone. So if it were to come straight in, right, you wouldn't really see it necessarily in the walls. Does that make sense?
So are you saying that the literature does not support that if serrated blades are used to make kerf marks, you don't see most of the time, I understand not always, but most of the time, striations on the walls of the kerf?
You will, but like I was also saying, anytime a knife cuts bone, you're going to see striations, right? Anytime a knife cuts anything, that those little imperfections in the knife blade are what causes the knife to cut. And so when we talk about a serrated blade versus a non-serrated blade, what we're talking about is the patterning of those striations.
Okay. And it's a pattern, right? They're not random. I mean, when we say pattern, we're talking about a strict pattern. It's consistent throughout. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, assuming it's the same knife over and
Now,
over.
the pattern you talked about,
Mhm.
did you grid off to check, in fact, of whether or not that was a pattern?
I'm not sure I understand what you mean.
Well, if you blow up a picture so that you can see the lines clearly, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can measure and see whether they're close or whether, in fact, this is a repeated pattern, correct?
So is what you're saying, did we measure in between those to see if it's the same one?
Yes.
I don't believe we did.
Okay. And I noticed, again, the prosecutor referred to those as 4 lines, 1, 2, 3, and 4, fourth being on the right.
Mm-hmm.
That one you mentioned was a lot more of a U-shaped, correct?
Are we talking about the number 4?
Yes.
Relatively,
Which would be on the monitor, the one
the one
farthest
farthest
on
to
the
the
right.
right, correct, yeah.
Okay.
Right.
And that was a U. So that's not necessarily characteristic of a blade, correct?
Right, so what I was saying is in relation to the other ones, of those other 4, it's wider and it's shallower. And so what I was trying to articulate, maybe it wasn't clear, is that when you take a knife like that and you use a sawing motion, you're going to exaggerate that cut mark and you're going to artificially make it wider. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, but it would stick with a V-shaped point in the middle, correct?
Yeah.
Which that does not have, correct?
I'm not looking at it right now. I believe it's more V-shaped than U-shaped.
But it's not as V-shaped as the other curve, what you would consider curve marks, correct?
So if I were to say, I believe it was number 3, the cut mark next over, right? I believe that one was much more V-shaped than number 4, if that's what you're asking.
So would that indicate to you, in your experience as a forensic anthropologist, that different instruments made those markings?
No, there was, I mean, they look slightly different, but there's also, it's not just a single cut from each of those, right? Each one of those is its own unique instance of sawing cuts, and so they all look slightly different from each other.
Okay. Now when we talk about sawing cuts, you're saying that somebody sawed into that jawbone as if trying to cut through it? Is that, when you say sawing marks, is that what you're talking about?
Well, I'm not going to speculate on the intent. What I'm talking about when I say sawing is, I mean, they're using that knife in a sawing motion.
Okay. Let me pull up the if you could review this on the monitor and with the pointer show me which what you mean when you're saying that somebody did a sign motion to create those marks.
Sure.
You may step down, and you may use the pointer if you wish.
Thanks.
The one on the right.
410 or 413?
Whichever one's on the right. And if you could hold the stick consistent with how a knife would be held, how do you believe those, what you call fork cut marks were made?
So, this fourth one here is actually slightly different than these first three. So these first three are more or less, the knife would have been more or less perpendicular to the
Can
boat
you
surface.
demonstrate with the pointer? If the pointer was a knife, how would those?
As if this was the cutting edge, you mean? I'm confused.
Sure.
Okay, so it would be something like this. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
And then it would be, some type of this motion. I'm not really sure if this makes sense with this pointer.
Kind of like a violin.
I guess.
Okay. And I agree, in between what prosecution labeled 3 and 4, the 2 marks on farthest over on our right,
This is 3. This is
there's no striations in between those 2 marks, correct?
like these striations, you mean?
Yeah.
In between these two?
Yeah.
No.
Okay, so you would say then that 3 and there was no defleshing in between 3 and 4 with the serrated blade?
Well, again, I'm not going to comment
Judge,
on.
objection that calls for speculation at this point, and there's no testimony of deflation in that area.
I'll overrule the objection. You may answer the question.
I'm just going to say I'm not going to comment on, again, the purpose of the cut marks, whether they're to deflash or to cut through the bone or whatever.
You'd agree there's no striations in between 3 and 4, correct?
Yes,
Or 1 and 2?
correct.
You'd agree that 3 and 4 are parallel to each other?
Yeah, more or less.
1 and 2 are parallel to each other.
More or less.
Did you notice that when you originally examined this?
Sure.
And you also say that the notch above what we're calling 4
Yes.
is also a cut mark?
Yeah, it does appear to be a cut mark. It's got this kind of V shape here. It's kind of hard to see in this image because it's really small. It's just at the very top of this little piece of bone here.
Say really small, it looks as wide as 2 or 3. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I just mean in length.
Okay. But it's deep. You can sit down. Now, would you agree that if that mark on the top notch was made by a knife, it would have to cut through the tissue?
Assuming there's tissue there.
Assuming
at the
there
time.
was tissue there,
Yeah.
you would not be able to get that mark without cutting through into the tissue. Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
Did you look at were you aware that Dr. Taylor, when she received this jaw, it still had flesh on it?
I was aware, but I didn't examine it until it was just like you see here.
Okay. Well, you would agree that examining it in its original state is important, wouldn't you agree?
I would agree, but that's just not always possible.
I want to hand you what's previously been introduced in evidence of States 232. May I approach your honor?
Okay.
You'd agree that that's the same jawbone in 410?
Mm-hmm.
You'd also agree that in that picture, that notch is not visible. The upper notch is not visible because it's covered by tissue.
Sure.
Right. So it wasn't caused by a cut mark.
I don't think I follow.
Any objection, that is misleading and there's no evidence.
this doesn't follow the question, so why don't you restate the question, please?
You had previously indicated that to get the cut mark on the top of the jawbone here, that's kind of in between the teeth, that was done with a knife, it would remove the flesh.
Well, it would definitely damage the flesh.
You would cut down to the bone, right?
Yeah, sure.
But in that picture you have right there, there's tissue covering that mark. Isn't that fair to say?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, you know what the ring, may I approach you to picture now? You know what the ring bone rule is?
The ring bone rule?
Yeah.
I'm not familiar.
Do you know how bones in the shape of a ring break?
More or less.
And, I mean, have you ever heard anyone compare it to a pretzel?
No.
No. Would you agree that when a ring bone breaks or fractures, it usually fractures in two places?
It depends on the structure and the force.
So, do you know whether or not the mandible is one of the oh, you don't know what the ring bone rule is?
I'm not familiar with the ring bone rule.
Okay. I got nothing for it.
Reverse the examination.
Thank you.
You know, I apologize, but I do have one more brief question.
Go ahead.
How much are you being compensated for being here today?
For being here today,
Yeah.
it's the standard rate of a forensic subject matter expert. So it's $2,000 for the day.
$2,000 for the day.
Mhm.
What about your travel?
I mean, it was just covered, if that makes sense, compensated.
So for being here today, testifying for 3 hours, you're getting $2,000?
Yes.
How many times have you testified before?
This is my first time.
Okay. And when were you contacted by the state?
Like I said, I believe it was last Wednesday.
Good week. Nothing further.
Redirect the examination.
Thank you, Your Honor. With respect to coming here, to Dr. What do you have going on back home?
Well,
Objection to relevance.
You know, the question is more for being here today.
Yay.
The objection is overruled.
Please tell us, what do you have going back on home with your personal life?
so my
We're going into personal life. It's going to be irrelevant.
The objection,
You know,
the objection is overruled. You may answer the question.
okay. So obviously Thanksgiving is coming up, and we have family coming into town for Thanksgiving, and my wife is approximately 2 weeks from giving birth, so she's kind of at the point where the baby could come any day.
And when are you scheduled to be?
Tonight at 11 p.m.
And you just told the defense lawyer that you were first contacted just last week, is that correct?
Correct.
Now, the defense lawyer referred to an article, and before we get to the article, just because the 4 lines are parallel, here it states it's in 410 on the right mandible, is that an indication to you, just because they're parallel, that is part of animal activity on this bone?
Objection, leading, argumentative.
I'm questioning about the counsel's question.
Still leading.
The objection is sustained as to leading.
Okay, with respect to these lines being parallel, what if any indication is that to you with respect to animal activity, if at all?
It's no indication. Again, what I was most concerned about is the determination as whether or not this is sharp trauma or is this carnivore activity, is the shape of the cuts themselves, and are they V-shaped or U-shaped? The parallel nature of it is kind of secondary to the characteristics of the cut to begin with.
Okay. And in the article that the defense lawyer referred to, the one that you provided to the state and that the defense lawyer also has, the disarticulation pattern and tooth mark artifacts associated with pig scavenging on human remains. Is there a photograph in there that shows pig scoring done by pigs on bone?
Objection, foundation.
That's been already made prior in a prior hearing.
In light of the cross-examination, in light of the entire record, the objection is overruled.
Thank you. Okay, is there a photograph associated with pig scoring that you reviewed pursuant to that article?
Yes.
And you are showing Council's remark as Case Exhibit 453. May I approach you?
You may do so.
Okay, Doctor, I'm going to show you. I'm going to mark this Case Exhibit 453. I'm going to ask if you recognize that.
Yeah,
And what are you looking at?
it's a figure from that article by Berryman that's showing evidence of post-mortem damage, particularly pig tooth scoring on a human inaudible.
Okay. And does that actually reflect the photograph that's contained in that article that we just mentioned?
Yes, sir.
Does it change or alter in any way?
Not that I can tell.
Your Honor, at this time the state will move into evidence Case Exhibit 453 marked for identification.
Mr. Norrie,
Anybody here?
you may.
Is it fair to say you have no idea whether or not that picture is a good representative sample of what pig scoring looks like?
So all I can say regarding this picture is that this is the only published picture that I know of that shows what pig scoring on bone looks like.
Okay. How hard did you look for pig scoring?
I looked throughout the anthropological literature that I'm familiar with.
How much of that deals with pig marks on bone?
Again, this is the only article I'm familiar with.
Did you?
Excuse me, Mr. Norrie, are you going to object to the
Yes.
picture? Okay, I'm going to decline to receive the picture, so let's proceed.
When you say this is the only article that you've were able to look for, are you doing a wide search, or are you confining it to the profession of anthropology?
So usually so first of all, I was familiar with this before because this isn't published in a book that's really classic for forensic taphonomy and forensic anthropology. So what I did is I did it's called a Google Scholar search for other articles that had, whatever the words pig, scavenging, marks on bone, whatever those words were, to see if anything else came up that was relevant. And I didn't find anything else personally that I thought was relevant, and that I didn't see any pictures of anything else.
Okay, and why did you consider this to be relevant?
Because this is published by a board-certified forensic anthropologist, and it's specifically looking at patterns of pig scavenging in human remains and the tooth marks left by pigs in human remains.
So the literature that counsel just read to you came from, I guess, part of the contents with respect to the definition, is that correct? When he asked you if you had given the full definition of scoring, and he read it to you?
Right, from that Berryman article.
That's from the Berryman. I guess now, is this, you said this comes from a text
Yeah,
versus a journal?
correct. It's from an edited volume.
Okay, and that text, is that something that's relied on by forensic anthropologists in your profession?
Yes.
And do you consider that text, and as well as the photographs containing in those texts, to be not only of use, but something that you can rely on as a forensic anthropologist who is board certified?
Right. I mean, that's the point of the text.
I'm sorry, I missed that.
That's the point of the text, is for other scholars to use it.
So, based on based on that foundation, the state would move into the state's exhibit 353 warrant for identification.
Respectfully, the court will decline to receive the exhibit. That's 453, right?
453.
Yeah, I'm going to decline to receive that. Let's move on.
Does the court require more foundation?
No. That'll be the court's ruling on the exhibit. Let's move on.
Can you, pursuant to that article, because counsel did rely on that and then did give, provide parts of it to you. Pursuant to that article, could you describe what the pig scoring house described, or how it appears?
Right, so the thing that I found most important from that article is that he says, in comparison to carnivore marks, typically referring to canid marks, in
When you say
bone.
canid, what do you mean by that?
Like canid scoring on bone. Does that make sense?
Canid,
Canid like a dog or a
okay.
wolf, something like that. So, which is kind of the more classic carnivore damage that we would observe to bone. So what he says is, in comparison to this more typical carnivore damage you see to bone, the scoring from pig teeth are shallower than even the normal carnivore teeth.
And the pattern, are you aware of whether or not the pig scoring pattern appears or looks anything like the, just to be clear, let me pull this up, State's Exhibit 410. Or State's Exhibit 414. Does a pig scoring appear anything similar to what is depicted in this image that's on page, State's Exhibit 414?
Objection foundation.
Now, this is according to the article he's read.
I will sustain the objection. Let's move on.
With respect to pig scoring, is there, does it discuss whether patterns of are patterns of the pig scoring anything like the scoring of serrated knife blade?
No.
And with respect to the injury that you see in State's Exhibit 414, do you see any crushing injury that would be associated with any type of carnivore or even pigs?
Yeah, so I don't see any crushing injury in this exhibit, nor did we notice any kind of, puncture, crushing injuries anywhere on the mandible.
Yeah, no further questions.
Recross-examination.
Thank you. In that study, is a skeleton that was found?
Well, it was human remains. I wouldn't say that they were necessarily completely skeletonized.
From one individual, though.
Correct.
Okay, and you're right, because in fact, the mandible was not recovered,
I believe it was not recovered in that case.
and it was believed to have been consumed by scavengers.
I don't remember what they said in that article as to the cause for it not being located. I want to say they said it was dislodged, maybe like taken away. It could have been consumed. I don't remember exactly what they said about that mandible. But I don't believe it was recovered.
And the ribs exhibited fracturing.
Sure.
Okay, and
This goes beyond the scope if we're going into
The
anything else.
objection is sustained.
Move to strike. Okay, question.
Motion to strike.
you had agreed that parallel marks are consistent with pig scoring according to the article.
Judge, objection, because that's taken out of context, and again, if we can't show the photograph, the jury won't see what the marks that's being referred to.
I'll sustain the objection in addition to witnesses in reference to parallel marks, reference them as more or less parallel. So on all of that, I'll sustain the objection. Or based on all of that, I will sustain the objection.
You agreed, though, that characteristically, scoring marks left by pigs, according to that article, these parallel lines.
Judge, objection again, because we can't show the photograph, that's misleading.
You relied on this article.
Again,
If that's misleading, the whole article is misleading.
the state would renew its.
The court will sustain the objection.
No further questions.
Are there any juror questions?
Yes, sir.
All right. Please approach. You may be seated. It may be helpful if you queue up the exhibit number 413. If you can just be ready, please. All right, I have some questions I'm going to read to you. After I read a question, you can then face the jurors and answer the question. After you're through answering the question, if you look back to me as you're doing right now, I'll take that as an indication you've finished your answer, and I'll go to the next question. After the last question, I'll see if the attorneys have any follow-up questions. If you would like me to read a question again, just let me know. I'll be happy to do that.
Thanks.
Okay? The first question reads, what type of carnivore caused the score marks in Exhibit 451? And we'll show you that exhibit.
So, I don't recall if the article specifically says which type of carnivore made each of these three marks, but within this article they're talking about carnivores like lions and hyenas, kind of bigger carnivores that have these like more pointed carnassial teeth, kind of like a wild dog would have. If that makes sense.
The next question reads, can you identify any other wildlife or wildlife body parts that would cause markings with a V-shaped mark? You may answer the question. So
I can't think of anything that would cause, that would be like naturally causing these V-shaped marks. So if you think about your teeth, and you might think about, like if you put your finger in your mouth and you bite down, you might think, oh, my teeth are really sharp. But even though your teeth are sharp, right, and they're made to cut for your food, they're not the same type of sharpness that a knife is. And so they might leave different marks, just like a carnivore's tooth might leave marks in a bone, but those tooth marks are going to be much wider, shallower marks than a knife, which is going to be made to make these deep penetrating cuts in bone tissue, or any tissue really.
Next question reads, in the injury to the jawbone in Exhibit 413, and we'll have that displayed for you. But let me start that question again because I misread one word. And in the meantime, we'll bring up that exhibit. Okay. All right. Let me start that question again.
Mm-hmm.
If the injury to the jawbone in Exhibit 413 was made by a knife or cutting object instead of an animal, can you explain why cut number 1 to cut number 2 appears exactly equal between cut number 2 to cut number 3 to cut number 4? You
Sure.
can answer the question.
So I can't explain how they appear to be equal. It's the same. I mean, if you think about it, like any type of cut next to another cut may appear to be similar distances or larger distances, right? It's all about how the cuts were made. So depending on how it was done, I mean that's why they appear to be different distances apart, and they appear to be parallel. As to what was going on, I can't say anything about that.
All right, the next question reads, what kind of bone was depicted in 451? Human or animal? What bone within the body?
There's a picture up there.
Please.
So these are the bones that they're showing are non-human animal bones. Which bones they are, it's kind of hard to tell. At least the top one, the one in A, looks to be like one of the long bones, like the upper arm bone or something. It could be. It's because they're really small, broken fragments. I can't really say for sure which bone is which, but none of them are human bones. They're all non-human animal bones.
Any follow-up questions, Mr. Rivera?
I'll briefly. Okay, so let me go back to Exhibit 451. You said the animals causing these injuries were referred to in the article as being either lion or hyena.
I believe that's what the
Carnivores.
article said, yeah.
And with respect to the other article, you noted that there was a difference between a pig's teeth mark versus the carnivore teeth mark.
Mm-hmm.
And what was that difference?
The difference was the score marks left by the pig's teeth were much more superficial and much broader than the typical, carnivore tooth marks that we would see in this example.
Thank you. Let me see if anything else. Oh, with respect to looking at Exhibit 413, which is depicted there,
Mm-hmm.
you said you're not, or you would, for you to answer why the cut marks may appear to be, I guess, 1 and 2 be of equal distance, the way 3 and 4 is. You said you could not speculate as to why whoever put those cut marks would have caused those distances?
Correct.
Do the distances between the cut marks at that point, do they have any relation, or does it have any bearing on whether that's animal activity to you or not, or indication that it's animal activity?
Like the parallelness?
Right,
of it?
correct.
Again, the reason that they're cut marks is because of the V shapes in the cuts. It's the parallelness doesn't really have that much of an effect on what the cuts actually look like and what the object that would have made those cuts would have looked like.
Okay. Thank you. No further questions.
Any follow-up questions, Mr. Martin?
With regards to 451, that article was clear that those marks were limited to lions and hyenas, correct?
I believe so.
No other animals in that.
I do not believe they have.
And those
other
were
animals.
created by canines, not incisors.
Just let me answer the question, right?
And those were caused by canines, not incisors, correct?
So I don't recall if they said these are only canines. I don't think they could say that they're only caused by canine teeth, because they also have bigger carnassial teeth that have points on them. So they're from the more pointed teeth in the jaw, if that's what you're kind of getting at.
None of those marks were caused by incisors, is that fair to say?
So I don't believe that any of those were caused by incisors, but again, I didn't see how they were made, so I can't say for sure that none of them were caused by incisor teeth.
You gave that article to the prosecution, correct?
Yeah.
And you can't determine whether or not any of those were made by incisors?
So the point of that article isn't really concerned about the exact tooth and which exact tooth makes which exact mark. The point of that article is distinguishing between the marks that are typically left in bone by either knife cuts or canine or carnivore teeth. So that's the point of the article. It's not to say this is what a incisor tooth looks like versus a canine tooth versus a premolar or carnassial tooth.
And with all of your anthropological experience, you can't tell us what bones were marked up on this?
Judge, objection, that's argumentative.
The objection is sustained. You may rephrase the question.
Given your vast anthropological experience, can you tell what parts of the body that those bones were from that were marked up?
Again, I object, that's misleading. He said those are animal, they're not human, and it's sarcastic and argumentative to the way that the question is framed.
I'll sustain the objection. Why don't we just ask the question? All right.
Do you have any idea what type of bones, animal bones, those are?
So, like I said, those are really small fragments. If you were to look at that, we would look at that image again where they have the scale. Those are pieces of bone that are only about this big, and these are again non-human bone fragments. And so it's hard to say beyond saying they appear to be long bones what exact bone they're from. It's similar to that little piece of long bone that we have in this case that we're referring to. It's so small and there's no diagnostic features on it. You can't say for sure whether it came from a humerus or a femur.
And again, with your anthropological experience, you can't give an opinion as to how parallel lines on the jawbone at issue in this case were created.
Right, so...
Judge, I do object because that does call for speculation. You can testify as to how the
The objection is sustained.
Thank you.
Did I understand your testimony, and I'm just paraphrasing, is that you don't know how those parallel lines became parallel?
Yeah, so again, I wouldn't speculate as to how or why those cuts were made in the directionality that they were made in.
Would you agree that if those were made in a non-laboratory setting during the commission or shortly after the commission of a murder, somewhat ridiculous to think that the person would be able to make parallel lines?
Judge, objection, that is utterly speculation, and that's assuming facts, not evidence. And it is.
I'll overrule the objection, although
That is
previously
ridiculous.
noted the witnesses testified that the lines are more or less parallel.
But the question was it ridiculous for a person to create those kind of lines that they immediately murder somebody? That's argumentative, and that's pure speculation. What is ridiculous?
The witness answered the question.
To be honest, I don't think I understand the question. If you could rephrase it.
An objection is confusing and vague.
You'll have to rephrase the question.
Would you agree that it'd be nearly impossible for a human, without the assistance of equipment, just using a knife, to create parallel lines on a jawbone like that?
Objection, Your Honor, that calls for speculation. Whether that's impossible.
I'll sustain the objection.
Would you agree that it'd be incredibly difficult for a person using only one knife, without any type of measuring tools, to create parallel lines like we saw on that jawbone?
Judge, again, objection, that's argumentative.
The objection is
Speculation.
sustained.
You would agree that, have you taken part in defleshing skeletons?
Defleshing human remains?
Yep.
Yes.
And with hand tools?
Yes.
And without the aid of any kind of measuring device?
Well, when I deflesh human remains, I do it in order to take the flesh off to analyze them, so we don't measure anything while we do it.
Have you seen students defleshing human remains?
I've assisted and taught students how to do it.
And you would agree that a human's not going to create parallel lines when they're defleshing?
Judge, objection, because this is argumentative, whether they're parallel, all four to each other, or 2 by 2, but it is argumentative, it's speculation at this
The
point.
objection is sustained.
Now, you had testified that you didn't want to speculate why somebody would make those cut marks that were made in the sign action, correct?
Mm-hmm.
But isn't that what forensic anthropologists do in their line of work?
We interpret marks on bone and we examine bone, but we don't go so far as to say like what that person was thinking or doing or feeling when those marks were being made. So we wouldn't say that, oh, this is the purpose behind these marks. We're just saying that these are cut marks.
What's the difference between an anthropologist and a forensic anthropologist?
An anthropologist?
Let me start that
Yeah.
question. What gives it the designation forensic? What does that
Sure.
raise it up to?
So forensic is just the broad term that means within the context of the law. And so while generally a forensic anthropologist is an anthropologist that studies human remains, like in this circumstance where we try to search for, recovery, and examine human remains in order to establish identity and how that person died and maybe the circumstances surrounding their death. But other anthropologists, specifically biological anthropologists that study bone, might do it for different reasons. So there's some biological anthropologists that study only bone from people from past cultures. There's some biological anthropologists that study only fossilized bones for evolutionary purposes. I don't know if this kind of is answering your question or not.
And in doing what the forensic anthropologists go, doesn't that almost always involves some level of speculation?
Judge, I do object, because that question is vague and ambiguous, is confusing at this point.
The objection is sustained.
Now, you were asked about the spacing in between what we're calling lines 1 and 2 and 3 and 4.
Sure.
And you'd agree that the spacing in between 1 and 2 and the spacing in between 3 and 4 appear to be identical.
So they're more or less parallel. They're more or
Well,
less.
now,
Yeah, Judge, I do object, there's no testimony that they are identical. The misstates the evidence. Or
Correct.
testimony.
As noted, the witnesses previously testified that they were more or less parallel.
okay, now, there's two things that I want to talk about. We got lines that are parallel, which is 1 and 2 are more or less parallel with each other. 3 and 4 more or less parallel with each other.
Mhm.
Correct?
Sure.
Would you agree, though, that the spacing in between 1 and 2 is the same as the spacing in between 3 and 4?
I would agree that it's similar. I'm not going to say that it's the same. I haven't measured it to see if it's the same or not.
Okay, you would agree parallel lines, spacing in between marks, are all things that would be important to consider in your line of work.
Yeah.
Thank you. No further questions.
Are parallel lines and spacing between marks important to consider what caused those marks itself?
Not necessarily. So again, the most important features to determine how something was caused is the features of those marks themselves, right? Are they thin? Are they squared off cuts from like you would see with a saw? Are they thin, narrow cuts like you would see with a knife? Or are they these shallow U-shaped things that you would see from carnivore teeth? That's much more diagnostic than parallel spacing or anything like that.
And is the spacing between lines in looking at exhibit 413, which is on the screen, are the spacing between line and 2 the same as between lines 2 and 3?
No.
Okay, is the spacing between lines 2 and 3 the same as spacing between lines 3 and 4?
No.
So does the fact that those spaces are unequal or not even, does that mean anything to you?
It doesn't mean anything to me. I mean, I'm not concerned about the spacing or the parallel nature of the lines. Again, what's most diagnostic to me is the shapes of these.
Right. And does the length of line 1, because it's shorter than line 2, does that mean anything to you?
No.
And the length of line 2 that's shorter than line 3, does that mean anything to you?
No.
How about the fact that line 1 is shorter than line 4?
Mm-mm.
You know, no further questions.
When you said the last question, was that a no?
That was a no. Sorry.
All right, thank you. Mr. Marty?
Thank you. Did you ever consider the possibility, instead of these being separate lines 1, 2, 3, 4, that these were in fact caused by 2 incisors, and these on the edges were the artifacts left by the incisors?
So,
that is those facts not in evidence at this point.
The objection's over. Can you answer your question?
yeah, so again, because these shapes aren't shapes that are consistent with the marks that are left by teeth, we weren't really concerned about how wide are these marks compared to how wide could these teeth be that could have left these marks, because they're just not consistent with tooth marks.
You're still considering,
Oh, you know, wait, just a second.
I think you misspoke.
Sorry.
I don't want the record hopelessly
Yeah.
confused.
Sorry.
I'm going to read your response as best
Okay.
I can, and because I don't want to, you said, yeah, so again, because these shapes are shapes that are consistent with the marks that are left by teeth, we weren't,
Yeah, so
how really wide these marks are compared to how wide could these teeth be?
right, sorry. So yeah, I misspoke. So what I meant is cut marks the first time. So because they're so indicative of cut marks, we weren't really concerned with could they have been caused by these differently shaped teeth, right? Because they're not consistent with teeth marks. They're consistent with cut marks.
and when you say they're not consistent with teeth marks, you're talking about what we keep calling 1, 2, 3, and 4, correct?
Correct.
You're not thinking
And
of
the record should reflect that while the last portion of Mr. Rivera's examination and Mr. Nardi's examination, the attorneys are using State's Exhibit number 413.
That's correct.
All right. Okay.
And so you're considering, again, 1, 2, 3, 4. But if we were to look not at those lines, but in between the lines, and if in between the lines, that could be consistent with a flat tooth mark, would you agree?
No. I mean, the space in between those marks, those cut marks, that's essentially unmodified normal cortical bone. So that's not bone that's been scraped down in between those marks. Does that make sense?
Yeah, are you saying that in between 3 and 4, that there's no scraping in between that?
I'm not saying that there's no scraping. What I'm saying is that, like, if I'm understanding you correctly, what you're saying is that those 2 grooves that are on the side are being caused by the edges of essentially a flat tooth as it drags across the surface. Is that correct?
Well, I'm asking if you ever considered that a possibility when reviewing these, that yes, the space in between 3 and 4 and the space in between 1 and 2 was caused by incisors. Did you ever consider that possibility?
We didn't, because that's not how the bone would be much more significantly modified in between those marks if that was from flat incisor scraping across the bone surface.
You have no experience, right, with analyzing pig marks left by pigs on bone.
Judge, objection, again, this goes beyond the scope at this point, because he was talking about teeth.
The objection is sustained.
You'd agree, though, those marks we looked at is 1 and 2, looking at the space in between the marks, what I'm going to now call as artifacts. And those were caused by incisors that would not only explain the parallel lines, but it would also explain the even spacing.
Judge, objection, that's an argument, that's a statement, it's not a question, and it's been asked and answered in various ways.
The objection is sustained, as asked and answered.
I've got no further questions.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much. And so we'll be excusing you, and best wishes to you.
Thank you, sir.
All right, thank you. All right, we need to see the attorneys for just a few moments, but ladies and gentlemen, we'll excuse you for the day. Thank you so much for your service, and we'll look forward to seeing you tomorrow at 10 a.m. Thank you very much. Again, keep in mind my cautionary service and have a good evening. All right, I'm going to ask council to appear tomorrow at 9:50, actually not 9:50, 9:45, just in case we have some preliminary matters with respect to the prosecution's next rebuttal witness, just so we can sort that out before 10 a.m. so that maybe with some luck we can start near 10 a.m.
Well, actually, Runner, on that note, it does me no good actually learning about what they plan on presenting right before they plan on presenting it. May I ask for an offer of proof at this point?
Okay, I thought you both said that we talked to each other about that, but apparently not, so.
Judge, does the court want an offer of proof right now?
I would, yes.
Yeah, I don't want to take too much time on this. So.
And I think it's in the court's interest.
Yeah, no, I understand. That's
Okay.
reasonable.
Okay. Judge, the offer of proof is,
No, I mean, tell me who.
oh, I'm sorry, Dr. Who? Okay, this is Dr. Bialis, Conti Bialis, who is a forensic pathologist on the level.
Any other rebuttal?
And we also have Officer Brandon Rodriguez, who's from the Maui Police Department.
All right.
Both scheduled for tomorrow.
All right. And then the first witness. Well, Mr. Pope.
Yeah, I'm asking for an offer of proof on both
Okay,
witnesses.
let's get the offer.
Yeah, as a forensic pathologist, first of all, because Dr. Lawford did testify as,
Did you say Dr. Lawford?
right, she's to rebut Dr. Lawford.
All right.
And she's to rebut a number of things he's mentioned. First of all, that he consults with medical examiners. He's qualified to do autopsies. In fact, he's done autopsies as a medical student. He speaks with, medical examiners or forensic pathologists, and essentially declares himself in the court as allowed him to testify as a forensic pathologist. Dr. Conti Dialwis will testify what exactly it takes to be a forensic pathologist. As this court had mentioned, when Your Honor allowed Dr. Lawford to testify as such, the court made it clear it went to weight versus admissibility. So we do want to rebut the weight that Dr. Lawford has testified. So
Any other with respect to this witness?
right, she'll also testify to as a forensic pathologist, because he testified as a forensic pathologist. He doesn't think those were a sharp blade inflicted wounds on the right mandible. So she will testify as a forensic pathologist who has no connection with Dr. Harrell, will be testifying that those are consistent with sharp tooth mark injuries on human bone. And this is based on her vast experience in handling autopsies involving sharp tooth marks on bone, as well as having observed animal marks on bone.
Other areas?
And those are the two main areas, Your Honor.
All right, and then with respect to the officer?
And she'll also testify about the removal, as a forensic pathologist, she'll testify about the removal of bone when flesh is pulled away, whether or not that is something that is medically, consistent or not.
All right.
And the anatomy of the jawbone.
And so is that it for the doctor?
And she'll discuss also about, as a forensic pathologist, about blood force trauma to the jawbone.
All right, is that it for the doctor?
Yes.
And then as to the officer?
And Officer Brandon Rodriguez, he is an experienced pig hunter. He will testify as to the habits of pigs when they are feeding, what kind of markings they leave behind, whether it be feces, plowing, and other indications that a pig had been feeding in a certain area, that they're known to leave certain distinguishable markings that pig hunters easily pick up.
All right. All right, thank you for that. And by the way, earlier today, Mr. Poe was kind enough to point out to me I was using the term LG2 and LG3 and the technology with respect to the cell phones. I was thinking about it today. It's the 2G, 3G technology that was referred to relative to the instruments and the towers. My apologies for that. All right, we are adjourned. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And please.